Welcome to the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production. For transcriptions, show notes, and extras, please visit us at theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. Now, broadcasting across the world from the heart of the American Bible Belt, here is your host, Michael B. Rush.
Hello, friends. This is Michael B. Rush, your host. Welcome back to the Black Swan Rising podcast. Our last episode focused on the lady, her dealings with the Lord's covenant people throughout time, how she played a major role in the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and in the destruction of the kingdom of Judah by Babylon, which resulted in their captivity as well. We also read some interesting accounts that are upheld by some of the German secret societies as being legitimate. I'm specifically speaking of the first Roderick report, which alleges that the lady appeared to some of the knights of the Teutonic Order and gave them an alternate history of Christianity and basically turned the narrative on its head and provided the fundamental doctrine for the rise of the Nazi Party. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. I only know that there was a box of documents that was delivered to Ralph Edel, who was a journalist living in London at the time, but of German descent. And Ralph claims that that box was filled with historical documents pertaining to the Nazi Party. And that's how those things came to light in the post-Nazi regime. I concluded that episode with an extract from the Ascension of Isaiah, which is an early Christian document from the first century AD that was ubiquitous in the early Christian church, that had a very peculiar prophecy regarding the rise of an antichrist in the last days who would come from a completely different firmament than our own, and that he would have power to cause the sun to rise in the middle of the night, which is very reminiscent of the miracle of the sun, which was recorded in conjunction with the Lady of Fatima. Now, one thing that I did not mention in the prior episode, because, frankly, the prior episode was going a little bit longer than I had anticipated, was that I recently went to Portugal and visited that complex, the church at Fatima that was built at the request of the lady and is the location where the miracle of the sun actually occurred. And I got to say, the entire place is very impressive as far as just the complex itself. There's a massive church there. And when you go inside the church, right up behind the altar of the church, and the entire church is dedicated to the lady. And you have this painting of the lady being crowned by God the Father, and Jesus Christ is standing off to the side. And she's being crowned the Queen of Heaven. And then you have statues of her at the complex on the outside of the church facing the square. There's this massive statue of the lady in queenly, robes, wearing a crown and depicting her as the sovereign queen of the universe. And it was just, shocking to see something like this, knowing, what I know about the history of the lady and her claim to be this ancient deity from, antiquity, venerated as the Queen of Heaven. And here you have her in modern times also being venerated as the Queen of Heaven. And, for the rest of my trip in Portugal, I just couldn't shake that visit. It was very disconcerting to me. And on my last night in Portugal, I was, sleeping in my bed. It's just this little small, skinny bed. I was the only one in the room. And I was just having a very restless night. And it was very late. I was the only one awake. And I'm just lying there in the darkness. And I just had this bad feeling. Like there was something unholy in the house I was staying in. And it felt, there weren't any lights on or anything like that, but it just felt like there was a darkness in the room. And I was on the 9th floor of a very tall apartment building. And in the darkness, there's this massive slam against the outside wall. And it just, it felt like it shook my room. And then it was, totally quiet. It came from outside the window. And I'm 9 stories up. And I'm going, what in the heck was that? I'm just lying in my bed, kind of freaked out by it, and just trying to go to sleep. And, I nod off to sleep, and then bam, the same thing happens right outside my window. And I mean, this was a very loud bang. This isn't like a bird flying into the window. And I have no explanation for it, given that I'm 9 stories up and there are no balconies. It was just a vertical exterior wall, and I'm just left with this totally creepy feeling, like there's darkness, a palpable darkness in my room. And then I just go back to sleep, and then I'm having this, I don't know, it's kind of like a fever dream. And I start feeling physically sick, and I start, shaking, like you're trembling from fever chills. And I have this vivid, lucid dream where the lady appears to me. Now, I can't see her in detail, but she looks exactly like the image of, if you go and look at the Our Lady of Guadalupe image, she looks like that, except for very exposed to the point that you can only see like the outline of that image, and it's a bluish white light. Very similar to what Chris Bledsoe said, that the lady was emanating a bluish white light, except for I just see like this Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe, image overexposed in bluish white light, so that I recognize that shape of that image, but I cannot see any detail. And she speaks to me, and she says, hold on, I'm going to grab my journal and read specifically what she said. Okay, so this happened on March 28th. And as I said, it happened very late at night. I was, again, the only one awake. So she appears to me just as I said. And this is like a dream, okay? But it was very, very real. And this is what she said: "Leave my message, the expletive, alone. I know that you know that I could have no power over the elect of God unless God placed them within my power." And then she was gone. And then I became violently ill and had one of the most miserable nights of my life. And I did not start feeling better until I arrived in America. That is a very strange experience, okay? So what does it mean? What is this, just some crazy fever dream? I don't I don't think so. I think that this was real. And I think that what she was referring to when she said that, I know that you know that I could not deceive people unless God allowed me to. Now, when she said that, I immediately thought of a passage in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. In this chapter, Paul is talking about how the sign that the second coming of Christ is at hand will be the coming of the great deceiver, who comes with the power of Satan and is able to perform miracles in the eyes of all people. And then specifically, it's this verse 11 and 12. And I'm going to read these because I think that this is what the lady was talking about. And for this cause, God shall send them strong delusions, that they should believe a lie, that they might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. I think that in the last days, God is going to permit this great deception to take place because he needs to sift the world. Christ said that, listen, he would that we would be either hot or cold, but that lukewarmness is abhorrent to the Lord, and he spits those out that are lukewarm. I think that this great deception is going to sift the people into two groups, those that are for Christ and those that are against him. And according to Paul, the Lord is going to allow this great deception to take place so that this sifting occurs. And I believe that the lady was telling me, listen, I'm just, part of this great sifting. Stop, shining the light on what I'm doing, is essentially what she said. Because the only things that I have ever done, and I've written some books on this. I've written a whole series on the Book of Enoch, and this particular message is discussed in volume 1 and 2 of the Book of Enoch. But it's very, very curious that I would have had this experience, and it was not a good experience in any stretch of the imagination. It was not uplifting. It was evil, and it left me feeling physically sick, violently so. It was one of the worst nights of my life. So I didn't share that experience in the last episode because the episode had gone on so long. But that is my own context with the lady, and so I guess she and I are not on good terms. But she has been after the house of Israel. She has been tremendous tool in the quiver of the adversary. And I think that we are going to see her take a major role in the events of the last days. I mean, for crying out loud, Chris Bledsoe said, that she told him that around Easter of 2026, the world was going to enter into the stage of the divine feminine. Now, what that means, I don't know, but I am nervous about it, which is why I think it's important that we get the word out on these things and help people reconcile all this strange stuff that's happening, because being able to do so is like receiving the vaccine for the disease before the virus begins spreading. So with that said, let's jump into the topic for today, which I mentioned we're going to talk about the Antichrist, but there's some groundwork that needs to be laid before we, get to the Antichrist. And that groundwork is found in Revelations chapter 17. And I think that, this ties hand in glove in with the prior episode on the lady. Revelations chapter 17 is about the whore of Babylon and what happens to the whore of Babylon. Now, I think that name, whore of Babylon, is very interesting, particularly if you think back onto the last episode and some of the things that were mentioned about how the ancient world worshipped Asherah, the queen of heaven. She was worshipped through fornication and, ritualistic prostitution, sacred prostitution, which is, an oxymoron. So I think that it's very interesting that John sees the whore of Babylon, because I think you could use that same term for the Queen of Heaven here. Now, let's just start reading chapter 17 in the book of Revelation, and it will give us some background that I think is going to be very important for us to kind of put these things into context and to understand where we are in the timeline of these things. So verse 1, "And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration." Okay, let's pause here and just kind of unpack what we've read. So John sees the whore of Babylon, and she is described as being essentially the queen of the earth. She rules the nations. The nations, the kings of the earth, are made wealthy by her. The inhabitants of the earth become drunken with the wine of her fornication, meaning that she is introducing all kinds of false doctrines and blasphemies that are corrupting the world. And that this woman is living deliciously, and she's full of abominations and filthiness. And John sees her and sees her scope, the scope of her kingdom, and he says that he wondered with great admiration, meaning he's totally blown away by what this whore of Babylon has accomplished. She's got global reach and influence, and it astounds John. Now, this woman isn't walking, okay? She's riding atop of this beast, this 7-headed dragon. And the dragon has 10 horns. And this woman and this dragon are mysterious. Specifically, it says in verse 5 that the name Mystery was written on the forehead of this woman. So what are we to take away from that? This woman works in darkness. Okay? The fact that John was taken to the wilderness, and in the wilderness he saw this woman. In the book of Revelation, when things are in the wilderness, it means that they're shrouded in mystery. You know, the wilderness is mysterious. This woman is mysterious. And her dealings and interactions and power and influence over the world is done in darkness and cloaked in mystery. So if you are talking about the world today and you're trying to look for the equivalent of this woman, you wouldn't be looking for an organization that is operating in the light of day. You would look for an organization that has great power and influence over the entire world, but that is pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Her dealings are mysterious. Her influence is pervasive, but her identity is mysterious. Okay, so now let's jump back into this explanation, because the angel is going to kick in and give us some commentary. I'm starting with verse 7. "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath 7 heads and 10 horns." Okay, so the angel here is now going to start talking about this beast. But I think that actually we need some more context because the angel is talking about all of these things in chapter 17, but John already saw something very interesting pertaining to the same beast in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. And we need that context in order to understand what the heck the angel is talking about in his commentary. So let's go to Revelation chapter 13, and we're going to get some very interesting information about this strange beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay. Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. And I stood upon the sands of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his 10 horns, 10 crowns. And upon his heads, the names of blasphemy. Okay, this is verse 1. So again, here, when you have something coming up out of the sea, it is symbolic of mystery. The depths of the sea are unknowable to men, particularly men in John's day. Because of the pressures involved and the vast depth of the ocean, it's mysterious. So is this beast that rises up out of the sea with its 7 heads and 10 horns. Now in verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth was the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Okay, let's pause here for a second. This should cause you to think about the same beast that Daniel from the Old Testament saw in his visions. If you go to Daniel chapter 7, you're going to read something very similar to what we've just read in the book of Revelation. And where this similarity should not be lost on us. I'm going to read some passages from this for context. Go to Daniel chapter 7, and I'm starting in verse 2. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from the other. Okay. John the Revelator saw this 7-headed beast come up out of the sea. Okay. Daniel is seeing a beast come up out of the sea, meaning there is mystery associated with these things. Okay, now we're going to verse 4. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and it made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, a second beast, like unto a bear. Okay, so you have a lion and a bear. Now I'm jumping down to verse 6. After this, I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard. Now, so you've got a lion, a bear, and a leopard. Now going to verse 7. And after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth, and it devoured, and it brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. Okay. You should be able to see the similarity between Daniel's vision, where he saw a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then this monstrous, dreadful beast that had 10 horns on it. Compare that to what John the Revelator saw in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13. I'm going to read these again. And I stood upon the sands of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, ding, 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 and its feet were as the feet of a bear, ding, 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 and the mouth was the mouth of a lion, ding, 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 ding. These are the 3 first beasts that Daniel saw. And then you have the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So you've got 4 creatures here: a leopard, a bear, a lion, and a dragon. Daniel didn't describe the 4th beast as a dragon. He just described it as being terrible and powerful and different from all of the other beasts that preceded it. Well, in Daniel's vision, he saw each of the creatures that he saw related to a specific kingdom that would rise to global power and influence from, over the course of the history of the world, from his day until the end of the world. Now, the fourth kingdom that Daniel saw, I believe, corresponds with this creature that John the Revelator is saying, which apparently is an amalgamation of all of the four beasts that Daniel saw in his vision. What are we to understand from this? We are to understand that this fourth beast that rises with these 10 horns in the last days will be the most powerful kingdom that has ever existed on the planet. It will have all the power of all of these first beasts, these master kingdoms that ruled the world in antiquity, and more. So now let's continue in verse 3. And this is where this starts to get really interesting. And I saw one of his heads. Now remember, this dragon has 7 heads. One of its heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there were given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue for 42 months. 42 months is 3.5 years. So we have this mouth speaking great blasphemies given to this beast. Now, I believe that this mouth speaking great blasphemies is the Antichrist that will arise in the last days. And it serves this beast that is represented by a kingdom that received a deadly head wound that should have killed it, but that it rises to power once more and reigns over the earth for at least 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Okay, let's continue in Revelation 13 for more context. And he, meaning this Antichrist, opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him, meaning it was given unto this Antichrist figure, to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Okay, so this is pretty intense. John is seeing that this Antichrist figure is going to come and serve this dragon-like creature with 7 heads and 10 horns in the last days. And the only head that we are given any information about at all is described as having been wounded with a deadly wound that should have killed it, but that it doesn't die. It rises to global power once more. Okay, with that background, that context, we're ready to jump into the angel's description of what all of this stuff means, which he gave to John. Here we go. This is Revelations chapter 17, and I'm going to start in verse 7. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and the beast that carrieth her, which hath 7 heads and 10 horns. Now I'm jumping to verse 9. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Okay, so the angel explains to John that these 7 heads of this beast represent 7 mountains, or I think that you can substitute in here 7 kingdoms, okay, that the woman had power over throughout the history of the world. Because he goes in and says in verse 10 that there are 7 kings, meaning there were 7 kings associated with these 7 kingdoms, and 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet to come. So what we understand by this is, by the time that John is writing this, 5 of these kingdoms that this woman had power in antiquity have already collapsed. Now, the identity of these kingdoms really isn't super important to us at this point in time. All we need to highlight is that the lady, she claims to have been venerated by all of the ancient kingdoms of the world, and that those kingdoms that venerated her have fallen. Now, John says that 5, or the angel is explaining to John that 5 have fallen and 1 is, meaning in John's day, one of these kingdoms is just starting to get its legs under it in John's day. And then that the last kingdom will come in some future date. And this last kingdom is associated with this head that receives the deadly head wound. Okay? So let's talk about what is the head that was rising to power in John's day. Again, we're talking about something that has to be cloaked in mystery. This wasn't something that was known by everybody. Because remember, the woman has the name Mystery written right on her forehead. And this 7-headed dragon rises up out of the depths of the sea, meaning its origins and the source of its power is mysterious. And there are things about this kingdom's power that the common man simply does not understand. And so what we're to understand by this kingdom that is rising to power in John's day is that it too was not what it seemed. So who are we talking about? Well, if you make a close study of the first 4 chapters in the book of Revelation, there is a theme of a nefarious group that the Lord comes right out and says, I hate these guys. He refers to them as being the Nicolaitans. Now, the word Nicolaitan, it's a compound Greek word from 2 words that mean people and enemy. So we're to take away that this group is the enemy of the people. Now, when you read the first 4 chapters, it's essentially commentary to the 7 churches. And there is this nefarious force that is infiltrating the 7 churches, and it's the Nicolaitans. And the Nicolaitans masquerade themselves as if they were covenant people, but they are not. They are lying. They are seeking to infiltrate the covenant people and usurp the power and the kingdom and use it for their own interests. And if you review early Christianity without any kind of bias, it becomes painfully clear that Christianity was usurped by the Nicolaitans. They succeeded in their attempt. Now, unless you are very familiar with history, this is probably all news to you. But if you do a deep dive into early Christianity, it becomes painfully clear that the Nicolaitans were wrestling away power from the original fathers of the church. And you see this intense power struggle in something that is known as the Arian controversy. So what is the Arian controversy? And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because my purpose in going through all of this is not to give you a lesson in early church history, but to focus on the events that are going to transpire in our day. But if you don't understand this, then you can't really grasp what is going to happen and in fact is happening already. Now, the name Arian controversy stems from a early Christian father whose name was Arius. That's why it's the Arian controversy. And essentially this all comes about around the time of the Council of Nicaea. Now, the Council of Nicaea happened around 325 AD, where you had a couple hundred church leaders, bishops and priests, gather together, and they decided that God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost were literally the same being. And they created a formal doctrine around that. And then they went and published that to all of the other churches. And this became the source of the Arian controversy, because Arius was very vocal in saying, what in the heck is this? This is not what the Bible teaches. I mean, how can you believe that God the Father and Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost are all the same person, for instance, when Jesus was getting baptized in the River Jordan and his Father speaks from heaven and the Holy Ghost descends as a dove, signifying that they are not the same, they are separate. And then he goes on to say, well, think about when Stephen was stoned. He said that he saw Jesus Christ standing on the right hand of God, meaning they were two separate people. Think about when Jesus Christ appeared after, when he was first resurrected to Mary, and Mary goes to embrace him, and Jesus says, touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. So Arius was using these things as, examples that, listen, this doctrine that you're saying, this Nicene Creed, this isn't based on the Bible. Now, the folks that were for the Nicene Creed, they said, well, of course it is. Don't you remember in the Bible when, Jesus said, I am I and the Father and the Holy Ghost are one, and that you need to become one with us? And, Arius said, well, duh, we are all supposed to become one with God. It doesn't mean that we literally become him. Just like, Paul told us that, a man and a woman are supposed to become one, meaning we're not that the husband literally becomes the wife. That's not what Paul was saying. And so you have this controversy, which, the first Council of Nicaea was, flatly rejected, actually. And you have Arianism, which becomes the primary doctrine of the church. And this is the case. It's formally adopted as the gospel truth in 328 AD. And it continues up until you get an emperor who is known as Julian the Apostate. Now, Julian the Apostate started out as Christian, and then he turned back to paganism, thus his name, Julian the Apostate. He said, listen, guys, we need to be nice to the Nicaeans, and you have to stop ostracizing them. And because during this period of time, anyone who believed in the Nicene Creed that God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost were literally one rather than separate beings that was false doctrine. And he kind of said, okay, guys, we've got to let them back in, and they can teach this if they want to, and those people that believe this, they can believe it. And this kind of created a divide in the church, and you become, you get the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and the Eastern Church supports Arianism, and anyone who's for the Nicene Creed is part of the Western Church. And that continues from about 363 to 379. And, then you have the Council of Constantinople, where the Rome basically comes out, and this is really driven by the emperor. He says, listen, we're going with the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is the right answer. Anyone who disagrees with this is a heretic. And then you have, corresponding with this, you have the Edict of Thessalonica, which was issued by the emperor, who at the time was Theodosius I. And he basically uses Roman law to say, listen, it is my way or it is the highway. We are going to persecute, the Roman state will persecute anybody who believes that God the Father was literally Jesus Christ's Father, and that the Holy Ghost is separate from them, that there are three separate individuals. Anyone who believes that is now a heretic and will be persecuted by the church. Now, one of the unintended consequences of this was you made essentially all of the Germanic-speaking people were Arians. I mean, they believed that God the Father and Jesus Christ were separate beings, that Jesus Christ was literally the begotten Son of God the Father. And the Roman state had just labeled them all as being heretics, and they were being persecuted. The Roman state was going and shutting down their churches and excommunicating all of their leaders, and essentially making anyone of Germanic descent a heretic. Now, again, the Germanic-speaking people were 100% of the belief that God the Father and Jesus Christ were separate beings. And so you start having the Germanic people who are being treated as enemies by the Roman Empire. They rise up and overthrow Rome. Rome falls at the hands of the Germans, the German-speaking tribes. And so you have this chaos that happens. And essentially in the collapse of Rome, you have the introduction of the Dark Ages. And for all intents and purposes, the Catholic Church really kind of went into oblivion at that point. And it wasn't really resurrected until you have Charlemagne, who was himself a German, who said, listen, we're going to bring back the Holy Roman Empire, and we're going to use the Catholic Church as the instrument for the religious branch of this. And then you have the beginning of a new era of Christianity, several hundred years after the fall of Rome with Charlemagne. So anyways, the Nicolaitans, they were involved in this whole process of trying to embed the Roman state into the organization of the church, and they succeeded. And the church would go on to become a major political power. And the Nicene Creed is the mainstay of traditional Christianity today. In fact, the only Christian church today that does not affiliate itself with the Nicene Creed is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known more commonly as the Mormons. They believe that God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost are separate beings. And this is why traditional Christians will point at them and say, they're not Christians. They don't believe the same way that we do. This is essentially a rehashing of the Arian controversy from 2,000 years ago. So why am I talking about this? Because this was all coming to a head back in John's day. And I believe that this is what the angel was talking to John about when he says, hey, one of these things now is, and it's rising to power. And then in the last days, there will be a separate kingdom. And this kingdom will be identified by having received a deadly head wound that should have killed it, but did not. Now, let's go back to what the angel said about this beast. Let's look at verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are people and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put it in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So just backing up again, this revelation starts with the whore of Babylon sitting upon a 7-headed dragon. And one of the only head that really plays a prominent role in the last days is this head that has 10 horns on it and received a deadly head wound that should have killed it. In verse 13, we understand that head rises to power in the last days, and the Antichrist comes to that kingdom, and that kingdom rules all the entire world and makes war against the saints and overcomes the saints, and meaning that the saints are under the thumb of this despot kingdom for a period of time. And then here in Revelation chapter 17, we just learned that these 10 horns, they hate the whore of Babylon. They actually end up destroying the whore of Babylon. And they do this thinking that they're fulfilling their own will, but secretly God has put this into their own hearts. And God hates the whore of Babylon and uses the wicked to destroy it. Okay, what does all of this mean? Well, I think that what you're talking about is a woman that represents an incredibly powerful organization that will exist in the last days, simultaneously with a kingdom that will have received a deadly head wound and will be associated with 10 horns. And presumably these 10 horns, they give their power unto this kingdom that received this deadly head wound. And because of that, the synergy of this relationship essentially breathes new life into this nation state that, for all intensive purposes, should have been obliterated by this deadly head wound that it received. And yet it now rises to power. So now we are left to kind of unwind this conundrum and figure out what the heck we're talking about. So given that this last head is the head that is around when all the fur starts to fly, this is a kingdom that if the Lord is truly about to come back, we should be able to identify who this kingdom would be associated with. So if you look at all of the kingdoms on the world today, was there a kingdom that was in a position of global power that received a deadly head wound that caused it to basically collapse? And then because of the synergistic relationship with 10 horns, this kingdom rises to incredible power again in the last days. And this conglomerate, this kingdom that was wounded and these 10 horns, they have to hate this other whore of Babylon. So they're competing for power. Well, I think that it would be fairly safe to say that the whore of Babylon would be synonymous with this globalistic, elitist agenda that is operating behind the scenes and seeking to control the entire world. And if you look at that globalistic cabal, is there a country that is on the outside of that cabal that would, reconcile with this description of having received a deadly head wound that, caused it to collapse? Well, I think that the obvious candidate for this would be Russia. Russia was the driving force between the Soviet Union, which rose to an incredible position of power. It was the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And then, to the shock of the world, the Soviet Union collapsed into bankruptcy. And I believe that that could be described as the deadly head wound that should have killed it. For all intents and purposes, from the perspective of the horror of Babylon, Russia is no longer relevant. But then Russia forms an alliance with 10 kings, and they lend their strength, and together they form a new coalition. Is there anything like that today? And I believe that the answer is a resounding yes. If you look at what the coalition that Russia has put together, it's called BRICS Plus. Who are these 10 nations that comprise BRICS Plus? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia. Now, according to the book of Revelation, these 10 nation states would have to hate the whore of Babylon. So is this true? I mean, are the powers in the West behind this global cabal, are they adversarial with these 10 nation states? Well, if you look at Russia and, frankly, most of these, and you look at what has been happening, these nation states, the primary motive for them coming together was to be able to put themselves in a position that they could counter the power of the US dollar, which this whore of Babylon is wielding against them like a weapon. For example, you look at Russia. The US dollar has been the de facto reserve currency of the world since World War II. And so all of these nations have had, lots of assets in US dollars. In fact, many of these nations have acquired US debt as a way of stabilizing their own currencies. But recently, the West seized $300 billion in assets from Russia and is threatening to give those assets to Ukraine to enable Ukraine to continue fighting Russia. So, and you look at China, China's being bludgeoned with the trade war. Brazil and India have been bludgeoned. South Africa, all of these, Iran, all of these nation states have had the West, they all have reasons to hate the power structure in the West. Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about the West, we're not necessarily talking about Americans. We're talking about the whore of Babylon. And this becomes clear when you listen to some of the things that Putin has said. In October of 2022, at the annual Foreign Policy Conference, Vladimir Putin said the following: Russia's battle is with strange Western elites, not with the West itself. In the United States, there is a very strong part of the population who maintain traditional values for which Russians feel kinship. But there is another West, aggressive, acting as the weapon of the neoliberal elite. So I believe that Putin here is not referring to America here, as he clearly says. He's referring to these Western elites. I believe that these Western elites are the whore of Babylon. Now, he says something else earlier this year. In March of 2025, in the Economic Times, he was quoted as saying that he and Trump want to establish cooperation, but that Western elites were seeking to undermine their dialogue. And he emphasized that the same group had provoked the Ukrainian crisis and many other wars around the globe. So clearly, Putin is talking about what we might, from a scriptural perspective, coin as the whore of Babylon. And he's saying, listen, we are fighting against this whore of Babylon. So these other 10 nation states, they all have similar stories that Russia has. They all have their reasons for wanting to create a financial system that will weaken the dollar and elevate their own means of exchange so that they are not under the boot of the whore of Babylon. The question is there anything that this group of, let's just call them 10 horns, could do to go against the whore of Babylon? Well, let's just look at some news articles over time that lead up to the formation of BRICS, and as a result, what BRICS may be planning to do. This first excerpt comes from Bloomberg. It's a Bloomberg article on November 28th, 2018. Here's a little extract. According to Putin, the volatility of dollar transactions is prompting numerous global economies to explore alternative payment settlement systems. Okay, that's from 2018. Here's a little excerpt from a Reuters article. Putin says United States uses the dollar as a weapon. That's October 27th of 2022. Then a Russian article in a publication called Rusi on January 11th, 2024. It says this: G7 countries have seized over $350 billion in assets belonging to Russia's central bank. Obviously, they're mad about that. Later that same year, in October, there was published in a publication called Numistic News on October 18th, 2024, the following: Russia's central bank plans to purchase silver as part of its national reserves. It will be the first central bank in history to do so. That same month, Ed Steer said the following about this: if Russia commits to amassing large positions in physical silver, the result could be a catastrophic weapon of mass destruction against the Western banking system. Well, we'll get to why Ed Steer believed that if sovereign states started accumulating silver, it would be the end of the Western banking system in a second. But let's look at another Reuters article that was published in the same month that all of this news came out, October of 2024. Russia is in talks with BRICS nations to create a precious metals exchange to rival that of the West. Okay, interesting. It seems like they're pretty serious about this. Then another article in June of this year, June 20th. This is coming from Interfax. The St. Petersburg Exchange signed a cooperation agreement with the state mint Gonzac on Thursday as it prepares to start trading precious metals. All right. Then this is from Trump's Truth Social account on July 6th, 2025. Trump said, any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy. Okay, so you start to see that there are some rising tensions between the BRICS and the West. Now, why would the creation of a bullion bank be a threat to the West? And why would this have anything to do with these 10 nations being able to destroy the Whore of Babylon? Well, let's look at it. Bullion banks simply do not function like normal banks do. In a normal bank, the bank can only lend $9 for every $1 that it has in its actual vaults. However, in the West, the bullion banks operate totally differently, radically differently. The Western bullion banks have essentially lent out approximately somewhere between 300 and 400 paper ounces of silver for every 1 ounce of physical silver that they have in their vaults. This is a huge amount of leverage. When you look at the amount of silver bullion that is actually available to fulfill these paper contracts in COMEX as of the time of this recording, it was less than 34 million ounces. However, there's over 10.7 billion ounces of obligations. It's even worse in London. London essentially right now, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but it essentially has no free silver. Now, it has lots of silver in its vaults, but that silver is owned by other people, and they're just acting, as, it's like, having something in a safety deposit bank or box in a bank. The LBMA is holding silver that belongs to other people. They can't give it away. They essentially have no silver to lend, and it's creating massive disruption in the silver market right now. And the reason that Ed Steer said that this is a financial weapon of mass destruction is because if the BRICS nations can create bullion banks that are literally backed by all of the precious metal that they say that they have, and the Western banks cannot, the Western bullion banks will implode. Because if you if you start having these sovereign nations like China, India, Brazil, and Russia starting to hoard physical silver, then it sucks up, all of the silver that's available. And friends, the silver market is remarkably small in the United States. I mean, not just the United States, the entire world. You will only have roughly about 1 billion ounces of silver that is available for trading, at any given time above ground. At today's prices, you could acquire all of that silver for $50 billion. $50 billion is nothing. Okay. If you're Russia and you just had over $350 billion seized, and you can stick it to the Whore of Babylon by going with $50 billion and buying all of the available silver that there is, and then letting the West choke on all of these paper contracts that are valued in the trillions of dollars that immediately you cannot fulfill, you create a weapon of mass destruction. Is this what the book of Revelation is talking about? I have no idea. All I know is that this is literally happening right now. You take this right from the headlines today. In fact, recently, India, which is the I in BRICS, purchased 1,000 tons of silver, paper silver contracts from London, who simply does not have that available to deliver, and they want delivery. What is that going to do? It seems, you're hearing about, people loading up planes and shipping silver to London to try to alleviate the situation. But India, they are paying almost $10 over spot for silver. So if you have silver and you're looking to sell it, are you going to sell it to London? Or are you going to sell it to India for $10 more? Okay. The silver is flowing to BRICS nations. And pretty much the only entity in the West that has silver is JP Morgan Chase, which has the largest private holding of silver in the world. It's JP Morgan and BlackRock have combined to create this silver hoard. It's very interesting stuff. I don't know if, how relevant this is going to be. I only know that this is happening in real time. And we could literally be seeing in the days, weeks, or months ahead, the collapse of the Western bullion banking system, which would result, just remember, friends, going back to the 2008 financial crisis, when you had all these derivative instruments that were created off of mortgage-backed securities. And what a fiasco that was. These are literal houses and mortgages that are being bundled and sold as financial instruments. And it was a complete disaster trying to unwind that. Think about paper, silver. It's just been created out of nothing and sold for an incredible amount of money. We're talking, again, about 10.7 billion ounces of silver that does not exist in COMEX alone. And, in London, it's much worse than that. So you could be talking about trillions of dollars in losses that the BRICS nations can force overnight, and likely is going to be happening at any moment. It's frankly miraculous that it hasn't happened yet. And recently we had the biggest single day drop in silver in recent memory. And, nobody really knows why, because the silver liquidity is so crunched at the moment. Especially outside of the United States. Right at the beginning of the year, the West, powers that be in the West, drained London of all of its physical silver. Maybe they knew something was going to happen. Now London is hosed, okay? And the chickens are coming home to roost. And, somebody is flying some silver back in jumbo jets over there to try to alleviate this situation. But what are you seeing with that big, massive drop in silver. I mean, silver hit all-time highs, the most expensive that it has ever been from a nominal perspective. It hit like $54. It's never been $54 before. And then it dropped, practically overnight. And prices on something that is hard to get your hands on, think of toilet paper during COVID or, hand sanitizer, things like that. The prices of those things were going through the roof because the store shelves were empty. The opposite is happening with silver. You can't, India literally can't get any more silver. India has put their silver market on hold, literally. You cannot invest in any silver EFT. You cannot, the mint, the royal mint in India has literally run out of silver. That's never happened in history. So you have a lack of silver in certain parts of the world, and London has no silver to be able to lend. And the people in the West, why the heck would you want to send your silver to London when you could get $10 more an ounce in India for it? So something is broken and it doesn't make any sense, but these bullion banks, they're able to short the market, which basically means that they can sell a bunch of their paper silver and drive the price down in the short term. And that seems to be what's happened. But the unintended consequence of this is that you say to the entire world, hey, we're selling our silver on sale. I know that you can't get this anywhere, but you can buy our silver now for 20% less than you used to be able to buy it. And that's essentially what they're saying. And so that the BRICS nations are going in and buying those paper contracts, and now all they have to do is demand delivery, and the game is over. So again, I don't know if this is what the book of Revelation is talking about. I'm just trying to take current events and reconcile them with what I'm reading in the scriptures. And to me, there is a remarkable symmetry with these current events and what I'm reading here. Now, so the book of Revelation says that this dragon with the head wound and the 10 horns, they take out the whore of Babylon and they do it in a single hour, which means this happens very, very quickly. And then it's over. So what does the book of Revelation say is the result of this? Well, if you flip over into the next chapter, Revelation chapter 18, you read about all of the kings and merchants of the earth, weeping and wailing because the whore of Babylon has collapsed and how that has impacted them. And you read specifically in verses 10, starting in 10, well, I'm going to start in verse 9. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore. So the merchandise that they were selling was linked to the whore of Babylon. So they're selling the whore of Babylon's merchandise. Now it's very curious what the first two and the last two things, there's a big long list of items that are identified as being sold by them. But in my opinion, it's the first two and the last two that are the most telling. So this is what the first two are. The merchandise of gold and silver, meaning these guys can no longer sell the whore of Babylon's gold and silver anymore. Now, if what I am saying is true, then the gold and silver that belongs to the whore of Babylon is this paper gold and silver. It's not real. But these guys, these merchants, they used to be able to sell it as if it were real. They'd get the same price for real gold and silver. But all of a sudden, in 1 hour, it's worthless. They can no longer sell it. And then the last two items on the list, you read in verse 13, and these things were merchandise of the whore of Babylon. It says slaves and souls of men. That is pretty curious, especially in light of some of the current events around Jeffrey Epstein and what he was involved in. And it's obvious that he was up to his eyeballs with the deep state, and he was certainly, trading in people. And that's very disturbing. But apparently, after this is over, these things fall. Now, I just want to reemphasize something here. It seems to me that the fall of the whore of Babylon is economic primarily. I mean, let's read a couple more verses in Revelation 18. I'm looking at verse 15. The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her, shall stand afar off for fear and torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught. So friends, as I read those things, to me, it sounds like the destruction of the whore of Babylon in this prophecy is primarily economic in nature. The merchants are upset because their pocketbooks are emptied. Their bank accounts are gone. They're not talking about, loss of life. That's not what's making them sad and sorry. Everything in this prophecy seems to point to economic conditions having been the thing that is impacted by the destruction of the whore of Babylon. Think about that in light of what I've been talking about in this episode so far. That's curious to me, because if BRICS does what I am theorizing is in the works based off of current headlines, then the impact of this would be economical. You would see the 2008 financial crisis on steroids, and it would likely kick off a global contagion. That I'm talking a financial contagion. We just don't realize how intertwined everything is. So again, the whole purpose of this podcast is just to discuss black swan events. What does the evidence say? What is it telling us right now? Because in retrospect, the evidence from a black swan is obvious. It's just incredibly hard to see in advance because of normalcy bias. You simply can't imagine that something like this could happen until it does happen. And then it becomes obvious that it was always going to happen in the first place. So according to my reading of the book of Revelation, it's this fall of the whore of Babylon that results in the elevation of this alternate conglomerate, which, if this interpretation is correct, and I'm not saying that it is, I'm just saying that there is an incredible correlation with what this ancient prophecy seems to be saying and current events. If this is true, then in very short order, we are about to see the rise to power of this country that had been wounded and then was joined by 10 others and now rises to a position of power and preeminence in the world, having destroyed the whore of Babylon and usurped her position. So this, in my opinion, has to occur prior to the other events that are discussed in Revelation chapter 13. And to me, once these things happen, then you can have the rise of the Antichrist. Now, with all of these headlines, purporting to something in our very near future, that aligns very scarily with the lady's prophecy to Chris Bledsoe that around Easter of 2026, the world would be entering into an entirely new stage. And might that new stage be the result of the collapse of the Whore of Babylon, the rise of, BRICS, and now the introduction of the Antichrist. So with this kind of background, and again, friends, I hope that this is all wrong, that this is not going to happen, and that all is well, and that the good times continue for many years to come. But at some point, Black Swan events are going to happen. And when they happen, they will change everything. And the day will come on the other side of these events that we will look at the information that's before us right now and say, duh, there it was. It was in front of us all along. Well, friends, that brings us to the end of this episode, and it sets us up for the next episode, which will focus entirely on the rise of this Antichrist. So until then, friends, engage in your own spiritual education. Seek the Lord while there is still time. Seek to be taught by him. Seek to increase the Holy Ghost in your life. And if you seek him, you will find him. Until next time, God bless.
You have just finished an episode of the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production, hosted by Michael B. Rush. For show notes, transcriptions, and extras, please visit www.theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, click the share button icon and send it to your friends and family. This will help to ensure the continued publication of future content. Michael thanks you in advance for sharing and looks forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep seeking, for they that seek shall find.